So in this second lecture this evening, what I want to do is talk about how we might frame this relationship between science and faith. And what I want to do to you is to explore this tension between the idea of there being a conflict between science and faith and the possibility of there being mutual enrichment. And what I want to try and do is explore these themes with you and see if what I say makes sense to you, and if it does, whether it opens up a richer and better way of thinking for you. Now, as I've already hinted this evening, my own story is very much that of someone who began as a very aggressive teenager, believing that atheism was self-evidently right, and therefore those who believed in God were mad or bad or sad or possibly all three, and basically took the view that science could answer everything. And again, that's a very important element of this new atheist worldview, which in effect is that religion just is irrelevant and wrong. It has nothing to say, whereas science is able to reliably answer all the great questions of life. There's no need for God, there's no room for God. And then I went up to Oxford in 1971 to study chemistry at university, expecting that to confirm my atheism. And in the end found myself challenged at a number of levels and began to realize not only that atheism was less adequate as a way of looking at the world than I had expected, but also realizing that it was existentially inadequate. It didn't give me as a human being what I needed to live. And alongside this, through talking to Christians, through reading books, I began to realize that Christianity gave us, if you like, this intellectual lens that brought things into focus. And so I made this dramatic transition from atheism to Christianity. But obviously that raised a very important question, which is basically, was I running away from reality in embracing Christianity? And as I've already said to some extent this evening, no, it did not. Faith is not irrational. It just goes beyond the limits of reason. If you were to inhabit a world in which you only accepted what reason could prove, that would be a very shallow and inadequate world. It would not include morality. It would not include religion. There's so many things it wouldn't include. You'd be limited to a cold world of logic. And we need more than that if we're going to lead authentically. And again, I gave you a quote from Terry Eagleton earlier, simply making the point that we hold many beliefs that have no unimpeachably rational justification, but are nonetheless reasonable to entertain. Or again, the feminist philosopher Julia Christopher says, whether I belong to religion, whether I be agnostic or atheist, when I say I believe, I mean I hold as true. This is something I can trust. This is something I believe to be right, and it changes me. It gives me a reason to live. And that seems to me to be very important. And a Spanish philosopher who I greatly like made this point, I think, very, very well. This is José Ortega, a well-known Spanish philosopher who I think puts his finger on a really important point, which is this: scientific truth is characterized by the precision and the certainty of its predictions. But science achieves these admirable qualities at the cost of remaining on the level of secondary concerns, leaving ultimate and decisive questions untouched. In other words, it may answer how questions. It doesn't answer why questions. And you and I are looking for more than the clarification of mechanisms. We're looking for the elucidation of meaning. I'll come back to that point because it really is important. He goes on, we are given no escape from ultimate questions like, who are we? Do we really matter? What's life all about? In one way or another, they are in us, whether we like it or not. Scientific truth is exact, but it is incomplete. And I would underscore that final sentence. Science is great, but it fills in only part of that big picture of life that you and I need. And we need more than that. So we've got to work out what else can help us to fill in those pictures. Now, I've been talking a lot about intelligibility this evening. Intelligibility is being able to make sense of things. But there is something else that matters to people as well. It's the idea of coherence. Coherence is about things hanging together. It's not just this little bit of rationality there, then a different bit of rationality there. There is a big picture, and it helps us to make sense of everything. And back in 1611, the English poet John Donne expressed his fear that radical new scientific theories were destroying the idea of a coherent world. He wrote, "'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone." And I won't be touching on this point as much as I'd like tonight, because I only have a limited amount of time. But those of you who read the New Testament will know that this theme of the coherence of the Christian vision of reality is so important. Think of the first chapter of that letter to the Colossians, which talks so powerfully about all things being held together in Christ. It's about a coherent view of the world which holds things together, in which you and I are part of things. To give you this more clearly, I want you to imagine, okay? I want you to imagine that you go to a mountain and you look down, perhaps you're up in the Alps, and you see villages and streams and woods and all sorts of wonderful things. And you've got a little camera and you take a snapshot of the woods, a snapshot of the house you see, a snapshot of the stream you see, a snapshot of the mountain you see in the distance. And then someone else has a rather better camera than you, and they take a panoramic shot of the whole thing. Now here's the point. Your little snapshots fit perfectly into the panorama. They're all part of that. And what the panorama does is tell you two things. Number one, the snapshots are part of that bigger picture. And number two, it shows you how they fit in. There's a panorama of reality. That's one of the key things Christianity is saying. And that positions us. We're in the middle of a world that makes sense, and we are part of it. We are meant to be there. We're valued. We can do stuff. And that, to me, is a really important point. Now, I mentioned Peter Medaway's point earlier on. Only humans find their way by a light that illuminates more than the patch of ground they stand on. In other words, we want to do more than survive, just looking at food sources. We want to understand the world around us. So here is the dilemma I faced as a young man at Oxford. I had embraced Christianity and was delighted by what I found, but I was still a scientist. So how did I bring together my science, which I loved, and my faith, which I just discovered? And one of the things I discovered is that in life there are older and wiser people who sometimes help you. And I'm going to tell you about one man who helped me begin to do this, and I think his approach may help you as well. And we find the ideas I'm going to describe in many writers. For example, in the philosopher Mary Midgley, one of Britain's better known philosophers, who writes these words: "For most important questions in human life, a number of different conceptual toolboxes always have to be used together." And this, in effect, is a method I was taught by someone I'm going to introduce to you now, and that is Charles Coulson, who is a name I don't think many of you will recognize, but in his day, he was one of Britain's greatest scientists. He happened to be a fellow of the Oxford College, at which I was based. He was a Methodist lay preacher, and he preached a sermon shortly after my conversion on how he held faith and science together. And he sketched a map in 10 minutes in that sermon. And that map remains with me today. So I want to try and explain to you what this man told me. And basically his argument went like this. It's not about a God of the gaps. In other words, God is something that explains things that science cannot explain. It's not about things you can't explain. It's the fact that we need an explanation of why science works so well. There's a very famous quote from Albert Einstein that I'm sure some of you will know. He wrote, "The eternal mystery of the world is its intelligibility, its Verstehbarkeit." And Einstein was just saying, look, why can we make so much sense of it? It's baffling, it's a mystery. Charles Coulson took the view, if Christianity is right, it answers that question powerfully and persuasively. That's the first point he made, but the second point is much more important. And this is the point I want to explore with you tonight. We can think of science and faith offering us different perspectives on reality. It's a very simple idea. I'm going to explore it with you. And Coulson, in his book Science and Christian Belief, basically argues that we need multiple perspectives on the great issues of life. In other words, he asks us to imagine something which, like life and the universe themselves, is big and complicated. You might think of a very complex building. You look at it from one angle, you see this. You look at it from another angle, you see that. But the totality is the sum of all those perspectives. In other words, you need all of these perspectives to come together if you're going to do justice to a complex reality. And that actually is what Coulson argued in a book called Christianity in an Age of Science. And Coulson uses an analogy. He was a very keen mountaineer, and he asked us to think of the Scottish mountain Ben Nevis. And I'm here providing a photograph of Ben Nevis on a good day, which is a very rare photograph, I have to say. And Coulson's point is this. Ben Nevis is a really complicated mountain. If you look at it from the north, it looks like this. From the south, it looks like that. From the west, it looks like that. From the east, it looks even more different. But it's all of these taken together. And his argument goes like this. Ben Nevis looks different when seen or approached from different directions, and he writes that in effect we need to bring these all together if we're going to give a total and satisfying account of a really big and important reality. He writes, a partial knowledge can be supplemented by sharing with others in the descriptions which they give us. The scientist can say it's like this, and then the Christian believer can say, well, it's like this as well. In other words, this supplements, it adds to, it enriches what the other is saying. And Coulson then gives, I think, almost like a prophetic anticipation of the views of Richard Dawkins. It is only the man who cannot or will not look at it from more than one viewpoint who claims an exclusive authority for his own position. In other words, you're saying the way I see it, that's it. End of discussion. What Coulson is saying is no, we need multiple perspectives. Science gives us some of those, faith gives us others, and they combine to give us that bigger picture, that richer vision of reality. And he saw that as being very important. Back to Mary Midgley, who is a very interesting lady who talked about multiple maps of reality. And again, there's a helpful way of thinking about this. None of these maps of reality, scientific or whatever, is good enough on its own. We need to bring them together. So he asks us to think about looking into a giant aquarium. And here's what the point she makes. See if this makes sense to you. We cannot see it as a whole from above, so we peer in it. Peer is an English word that means looking hesitantly. You don't see the full picture. Through a number of small windows, we can eventually make quite a lot of sense of this habitat if we patiently put together the data from different angles. But if we insist our own window is the only one worth looking through, we shall not get very far. So it's a very important approach. Think about it. Science offers this perspective, religion this perspective. Taken together, they enrich. Now, I'm going to explore this further shortly, but let's look at another approach now, which thinks not so much as multiple perspectives, but different levels of explanation. Those of you who are scientists will know this idea already. If you're not, let me try and explain what this means. It's saying that with a complex reality, you need to offer multiple levels of explanation to make sense of things. So let me give you a complex thing. I'm going to ask you to think of a kettle boiling, okay? A kettle boiling. Just hold that image in your mind. And the question I'm going to ask is, why is the kettle boiling? An English geologist called Frank Rhodes used this analogy extensively, and he said, well, here's one explanation. The kettle is sitting on a gas burner, and the gas is burning, and so we're having a conversion, an energy conversion from chemical energy to kinetic energy. So in effect, that brings the water to boiling point, and as a result, that's why the kettle is boiling. But he then offers a second explanation, and it's this: the kettle is boiling because I wanted to make myself a cup of tea. Very English. Very English. Now, just hold that in your mind, okay? Here is my question to you. I gave you two answers, okay? Energy conversion, wanting a cup of tea. Explanation one is right. Does that mean that explanation two must be wrong? Explanation two is right. Does that mean, therefore, that explanation one is wrong? Well, no, they are just different levels of the same thing. It's a complex thing that's happening, and there are multiple levels of explanation. They're all part of the picture. The chemical energy stuff is there, but it's only part of the picture. The making a cup of tea is there, it's only part of the picture. And the best picture is always going to be the one that weaves together the greatest number of explanations. Richard Dawkins says that when you look at something that's happening, you can offer a scientific explanation, and once that explanation is given, there is nothing more to be added. Well, he's just not right. Simple as that. Knowing about energy conversion does not, in effect, tell you that I wanted a cup of tea. It's a very, very simple analogy. Once you see that, it opens really important ways of thinking about this. This is Frank Rhodes exploring this analogy for himself. Now, these are different answers: energy conversion, cup of tea. But both are true, both are complementary and not competitive. One answer is appropriate within a particular frame of reference, the other within another frame of reference. There is a sense in which each is incomplete without the other. Now that, I think, is really helpful. Let me tell you a story about myself, okay? I've loved astronomy for ages, and when I was young, in my early teens, I used to look at the night sky, for example, the belt of Orion, and I would look at those stars, and I knew that they were so far away that the light leaving those stars right now wouldn't arrive at Earth for hundreds of years. And so for me as an atheist teenager, those stars were symbols of human insignificance. I did not matter. Human life was insignificant against that backdrop. In effect, I was looking at those stars through an atheist lens, an atheist way of looking at things. Early this morning, as I was preparing to come here to Aarhus, I had to get up very, very early. It was a brilliant frosty morning, and there was the night sky. And I looked again at those stars. But the thought that went through my mind was not, oh dear, I'm going to die. Isn't that pathetic and miserable? It was something like this: the God who made those also made me, and I matter to him. Or if you want to read Psalm 8, which puts it much more effectively and beautifully, when I consider the heavens, the work of your fingers, and it talks about the beauty of the night sky. What are we? We are so small and insignificant, and yet we matter to God. Now I want you to try and understand the point I'm making. I'm saying that the frame of reference, the lens you use to look at the world, affects what you see. And what I'm saying to you is, I look at the night sky and nothing that astronomers say is contradicted by that. But something is added to it. Something very, very important. Not just about the beauty of God being reflected in that solemn stillness of the night sky, but that about it being a symbol, a reminder of the love of God for his creation, including us. That's the idea of enrichment I want to explore in this lecture. And in many ways what I'm saying is we must resist reductionism. We need to open up something richer and deeper. Again, we explored earlier this idea of human beings. I made the point we have multiple levels of existence. And yes, we are made up of atoms and molecules, but there's rather more to us than that. We are not just only atoms and molecules. We are that, but we are so much more than that. And that's one of the key points we find in both the Old and New Testaments. Yes, we come from dust, and one day we'll return to dust, but there is a loving God who in effect brings a new quality of meaning and vitality and richness to our lives, and that's really important. And again, you can think of lots of other possibilities. For example, you might just say that we are simply a complicated machine of chemical reactions. And that's true, but again, there is so much more that needs to be said. So I come back to that quote from Peter Medawar, that there are questions that science cannot answer, that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer, and as human beings we need those deeper answers. What I'm suggesting to you is that we do not critique science when it's good science. The real problem is when a scientist says, well, you know, we are atoms and molecules, and that is the end of the story. Our response ought to be, we certainly are atoms and molecules, but there is more that needs to be said. You have given us an incomplete account of who we are and why we matter, and there is a lot more that needs to be said. So thank you for getting a very good discussion underway, but there is a lot more that needs to be said. Now that, I think, is a really important point, because very often the problem is not science itself, but metaphysically inflated visions of science, which in effect import very radical atheist presuppositions and make that the metaphysical foundation of what they're saying. Where science stays close to its empirical base, there isn't a problem. It's when it begins to interpret and inflate and overinterpret this that the problems begin to emerge. I come back now to the problem of meaning, and I made the point this is really significant. And what I'm going to do is to teasingly explore this point with you by looking at one of Albert Einstein's letters. And there's a letter of condolence written to the family of Michel Besso, who was a good friend of Einstein's, who died in March 1955. And he was a physicist. And Einstein, as you will know, is remembered for many things, including his theory of relativity. And the theory of relativity basically argues that there are these things called world lines, X, Y, Z, T1, X, Y, Z, T2, and so on. In effect, these are the ways in which things move through a world of space and time. And this is what he wrote in this letter of condolence to Michel Besso's family. Now, he has departed from this strange world a little ahead of me, but that means nothing. For believing physicists like us know that the distinction between past, present, and future has only the meaning of a persistent illusion. Now, those of your physicists will say, well, we can see what he's getting at. Probably Michel Besso's family and the rest of you will say, well, actually, what you are talking about is a past when we didn't live, a future when we'll be dead, and the present when we're alive. And actually, life is quite important to us. And you don't really seem to make room for that. And this is a very interesting point, because actually, Einstein began to realize there was a real problem here. It came out in a very interesting debate or discussion with the philosopher Rudolf Carnap. And I'm going to tell you what Carnap said. They met at Princeton in the late 1940s, and Carnap basically said that Einstein realized there was something about human nature which thought that life was really significant, and that questions of meaning had to be engaged. And Einstein was really talking simply about physics when there was clearly much more that needed to be said. Here's what Carnap said. The problem of now, in other words, why this moment when we are alive really matters. It worried Einstein seriously. He explained the importance of the now meant something special for men and women, something different in the past and the future. Now listen to this. But that this important difference doesn't and cannot occur within physics. And the point I'm trying to make to you is that physics is great in looking at lots of things, but it is unable to engage at certain levels that are really important for human beings. Einstein's thought, Carnap wrote, that these scientific descriptions cannot possibly satisfy our human needs, that there is something essential about the now which is just outside the realm of science. And that, I think, is a very important insight, because in many ways what I'm suggesting to you is that we need to enrich a purely scientific vision of reality. It's great in understanding how this world works. It makes us appreciate all the more, but it does not deal with those deeper issues of why am I in this world at all? What is the deeper meaning of this world? Does it point to anything beyond itself? What is the good life, and how can I lead it? So nothing I'm saying criticizes science. But I'm saying you and I as human beings need this bigger picture of reality. And I've used this language of enrichment. In the title, I talked about from conflict to mutual enrichment. Conflict is this idea science and religion are permanently at war with each other. And you find that in the New Atheism. For example, you find it in Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, whereby a very selective reading of history, he creates the impression there's a permanent conflict between science and faith, with faith invariably being reactionary and against science. Let me give you just one example to show you how he paints this picture. He gives an example. The American theologian Robert Dwight, this is about 1800, was severely critical of smallpox vaccination on religious grounds. There, that shows you religious people are anti-science and backward. But those of you who are historians here will say, well, isn't there rather more that needs to be said? You might mention, for example, the American theologian Jonathan Edwards, first president of Princeton, who 40 years earlier, wanting to show his students at Princeton that smallpox vaccination was good and safe, was vaccinated himself, and 5 days later died as a result. Now, you might think that ought to have been there in the picture. Someone who, a leading religious thinker who said, this is something good, let's use it, even if it cost him his life. And those of you who know even more will say, well, let's just come forward to the 20th century and think about the atheist novelist George Bernard Shaw, who opposed smallpox vaccination as a sham, a fraud, and ridiculed people like Louis Pasteur and Robert Lister, who did so much to, in effect, lay the foundations of so much contemporary medical practice. Here's a leading atheist writer of the 20th century rejecting smallpox vaccination. By a highly selective cherry-picking of historical fact, Hitchens creates the impression of an overall pattern when it just isn't there. It's a matter of presentation, not reality. And you would have no difficulty in going back to leading scientists like Isaac Newton, or indeed coming forward to others as well, who would argue that their faith gave a new motivation to their science. Those of you who read John Calvin will know that Calvin expressed himself to be envious of astronomers and physiologists. Why? Because they got to study the creation of God up close and personal, and thus, in a sense, appreciate the wisdom of God better than he did. But I must end. I'm going to end by just laying out a line of thought, which I think is really interesting. Let me go back to Richard Dawkins, always a good person to engage with. Richard Dawkins argues like this in his book, Unweaving the Rainbow. He argues that religious people, because of their belief in God, when they look at the world, they see it in a less satisfying and eloquent and engaging way than an atheist like himself. There is no evidence for this, I need to add, but certainly what he thinks. But here's my question to you. When I look at, for example, I was coming up on the train, I looked at your coastline, beautiful bays, beautiful blues, beautiful greens, it was wonderful. And I thought, that is just so wonderful. But here's the point I want to make. I think anyone would think that, whether they believe in God or not. I don't see how my belief in God interfered with my appreciation of natural beauty. And here's the really important point. If you're a Christian, in effect there is a motivation not simply for doing science, but also for appreciating nature. Because if nature is God's creation, then every inkling, every intimation of beauty that you and I see in the world around us makes us look upwards to the still greater beauty of God. We appreciate what we see, and we realize there is something even better lying beyond it. Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of the Lord. And I think that's a very important point to make, because the Christian framework is a way which does more than simply make sense of what we observe and what we experience, and reassures us this all holds together in a meaningful way. It lets us look at the world and say, that is beautiful. And there's an even more beautiful God who is pointed to by this nature. And the beauty of nature, which is often breathtaking, is a reminder of the even greater beauty of God, which one day we will see in all its fullness. Let me end this lecture by trying to summarize what I've been saying. In many ways, I've been telling you my own story. I've been trying to explain to you how I moved from seeing science and religions being in conflict, science entailing atheism, to a rather different way of looking at things, where Christianity and science can be ways of beginning to fill in a deeper picture, a richer vision of reality. And that word enrichment, I think, is very important to me. The main thing I want to emphasize in ending is simply this point, that if postmodernity is right, then there is no right way of looking at things, as a new atheism sometimes seems to suggest. They argue that there is only one way of seeing science and religion, and that is conflict. I don't agree with that. I think there are many more possibilities at our disposal. And what I've been trying to say to you is that there's a way of seeing science and religion as filling in parts of a bigger picture. And the bigger picture is really what satisfies even more. If I had time, I would mention other points. And here's one I'm not going to talk about, but which nevertheless does seem to me to be very important. Why is it that human beings mess nature up so much? And you can see immediately how the Christian understanding of sin does begin to help us answer that question of why we look at something so beautiful as nature and end up despoiling and exploiting that. That, however, is for a different lecture. If you want to have an image to end this lecture with, it's the night sky. Imagine two people looking at it. The atheist who looks at it and says, well, you know, there's a night sky, I can name those stars, and I can talk to you a bit about the mechanisms of nucleosynthesis in stellar nuclei, which is very interesting, I assure you. And, you know, I would say, well, that's right, yes, I agree with that. But there is so much more that needs to be said. Above all, this distinctively Christian idea that God, the creator of our world, has studded the creation with signs of wonder and beauty and glory, which draw us to appreciate nature, but also intimate, that beyond nature, there's a greater beauty still, which is God. And that seems to me to be a very important point to make. So much more I could say. I've run out of time. We're going to, in effect, move immediately into a time of questions and answers, and you are most welcome.